This video will cover terms for discussing prosody and form. Prosody is the pronunciation of the song or melody in a poem, and within prosody we have a lot of different terms that we can discuss. One of them is rhythm, and that's where we measure the beat or tempo of a poem. This would be your heavy stress syllables that determine the accent or beat when you read through a line of poetry. Engine is where you will scan the poem to establish the metrical pattern, looking for things like stressed and unstressed syllables. Let's talk a little more about feet and meter, which are two very important words talking about prosody. So a poetic foot is a measurement of the relationship of syllables and stresses. And the terms I want you to remember are the heavy or primary stress, which is the accented syllable in a foot, versus the light stress, which is a syllable that is unaccented. And we have several terms for talking about different kinds of feet and whether or not those feet have heavy or light stresses. So an I am is the most important foot when discussing poetry. And this is a poetic foot with two syllables, which has a light followed by a heavy. And so when we're talking about iambic pentameter, such as when Shakespeare is using it in most of his work, we're really talking about two-syllable feet with a light followed by a heavy. So for example, to be or not to be is an iamb, set of iambs. A trochee is the opposite of an iamb, and that's where you have a two-syllable foot, a heavy followed by a light, which is a lot of our words in English are trochees, such as author, early, morning. You can hear the heavy stress on the beginning of the word versus on the end. Meter is the number of feet in a line of poetry, and the one type of that we see most often is pentameter, poetry line with 5 feet. So that would be 10 syllables in the line of poetry. And of course, pentameter is something that we discuss with Shakespeare as well. So when Shakespeare writes an iambic pentameter, he's writing using all iambs with 5 feet in each line. Rhyme is where we have words that are identical in sounds. And so when we establish a rhyme scheme, we're looking at the poem's pattern of rhyming sounds, often schematized with letters. So you might have an A, B rhyme scheme where the end of the A lines rhyme and the end of the B lines rhyme. So the word rhyme means words containing identical final syllables, and we have a couple of different types of rhyme. Internal rhyme is where you'll find rhyme within an individual line of poetry. So, for example, from Annabel Lee, the Poe's poems, and so all the night tide I lie down by the side is one line, and night tide and side both rhyme. Exact rhymes are rhymes with identical rhyming sounds, and those are pretty easy to find. What are harder to find are I and sight rhymes, which are identical in spelling but different in pronunciation. So, for example, stove, prove, and above all end in OVE, but they are sight rhymes rather than exact rhymes. Inexact rhymes are used a lot in poetry because they allow the poet a little more flexibility instead of having to find an exact rhyme. So, for example, bleak and broke. There's different vowels, but it's the same consonant. Could and solitude is very similar as well. So you'll see those a lot in poetry. More terms to be aware of when talking about prosody. A caesura is a longer pause in a poem, usually indicated by punctuation. You'll see commas, periods, semicolons, sometimes hyphens or dashes. So these indicate a longer pause when you're reading through a line of poetry. An enjambment is when a line of poetry has no punctuation at the end, and so when you're reading it, the thought carries over to the next line. This is also called a run-on line, and so when you read it, you're supposed to read straight through to the next line. Alliteration is a term you might be familiar with. This would be the repetition of identical or similar consonant sounds in different words, and so you put them together and you get alliteration. Such as laborious, heavy, busy, bold, and blind. is the repetition of identical vowel sounds in different words. So you're going to remember the difference between the two. So an example of assonance would be, and more to lull him in his slumber soft. So you can hear those identical sounds repeated through the vowels. Is a word designed to imitate or suggest a situation, sound, or action. Something like buzz, slap, or stomp, like the sound that it would make. Is a good sound, is we have words that are put together to sound pleasant to the ear. The consonants have a smooth flow, so a lot of our fricative sounds, such as M's, N's, L's, will create euphony. And cacophony is the opposite. That is a bad sound, choppy, with noisy pronunciation. And usually this will be a group of words together that create cacophony. So something like black bug's blood will be an example of cacophony. Those are our terms for prosody. We want to now on to forms. Forms is how you shape the poem, and we have quite a few as well. Basic terms, we have types of forms. Closed form, which use specific and traditional patterns produced through line length, rhyme, line grouping, stanzas, things like that. So your closed form poems are going to be very set. Open form is the opposite, and these eliminate restrictions and allows the author to fuse form and content by stressing speech-like patterns and easy-flowing word order. So you'll notice a lot of modern poetry is open form because it's much easier to use. It allows the poet to just kind of do their own thing, and it's not completely unrestricted, of course, but it is a little bit easier to write. A couple other terms I want you to know. The line of poetry is equivalent of a sentence. When you're looking at it on the page, it's measured and restricted, so it's from one end to the other and just on one line. And stanzas are a grouping of lines sort of equivalent to a paragraph in thought. So whenever you see a white break between two lines of poetry, we're moving on to the next stanza. A couple of other terms I want you to be aware of. These are the building blocks of our other types of forms. These would be couplets and quatrains. Now, a couplet is two rhyming lines. They're identical in length and meter. This is the shortest type of a poem, and sometimes you'll just see couplets together. But most of the time, couplets are used to build longer poems, so you'll see multiple sets of couplets together. They usually express a complete idea, and they are grammatically self-sufficient. That is, you have one thought, so it's like one sentence, but with two lines of a poem. A quatrain is 4 lines, and they typically have a patterned rhyme scheme, which can vary quite a bit, and we use them to build much longer poems, such as sonnets and ballads. The first type of poem I want you to know is blank verse, and blank verse is unrhymed iambic pentameter. And so we talked about iambic pentameter just a little bit ago. This is unrhymed though, so there's no rhyme scheme. It resembles normal speech, but it is still poetic. Wordsworth is the example on the screen, and he is an American poet who used it a lot. It is the most adaptable form because it does sound like normal speech, and that's why Shakespeare was so fond of it. So Shakespeare's kind of known as our master of blank verse. The next type I want you to know is a sonnet. Sorry, there's no title on the screen. This is a 14-line Italian poem. There are 2 types of sonnets, Petrarchan and Shakespearean. And Petrarchan are written by Petrarch. They're not as common, but Shakespearean sonnets are very common. And you'll see on the screen an example, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day? The rhyme scheme is very specific. It goes A, B, C, D, E, F, and then the last 2 lines rhyme as G, G. An ode is another type of poem. These are much more variable than, say, a lyric or song type poem, but they do kind of sound similar. They tend to have varying line lengths and very intricate rhyme schemes, But the thing that sets an ode apart is it is very meditative and philosophical in its content. And so you'll see a lot of odes to inanimate objects, or odes to things like Nightingale, which is something that Keats has written. An elegy, similar to an ode, is kind of a sad poem. There tend to be laments about death or mortality, and what does that mean for people who go on living. Elegies are one of our oldest types of poems, and they're really distinct in really just the topic that they use. They extend back to ancient times because people have been dying since we've been living, so there's been this need for poems to help us get through lament. They also encompass pastoral poems, which are poems that talk about rural lives and concerns and make allegorical ties to urban life. Ballads are narrative descriptive poems. They sometimes have very dramatic dialogue in them, so they tend to be a little bit longer and tell a whole story. They originate in folk literature, so the example on the screen, Sir Patrick Spens, is a folk tale. And they have a very distinct rhyme pattern where the second and the fourth line will always rhyme, but the first and the third won't. Haiku, you might be familiar with, as a Japanese poem. It has very strict rules. There are 3 lines. They have 5 syllables, 7 syllables, then 5 syllables. The topic is almost always something to do with nature, and it usually embodies some kind of unique observation or insight. So there's a point to the poem. Usually like a turn in the last line. They're very hard to write, but they're kind of neat to look through. There's lots of examples out there. Free verse is an open form type, and this is just an example. So we often call open form poetry free verse poetry as well. Walt Whitman, another American poet, is known for his free verse. A couple of types of open form poems. Prose poetry, it looks like prose, so it looks kind of like fiction. It's set up in a paragraph. So it's printed in blocks and paragraphs instead of in lines and stanzas, but we have this progression of images and this cadence of language and rhythm that makes it a poem rather than just a short story. There's an example in your textbook on 953 if you want to look at it. Also, shaped and visual poetry is something we can discuss for open form poems. We have an emphasis on idea and emotion with the subject, but also the shape of the poem shows the idea that's encompassed in the poem. Balances the pleasure of seeing with those of hearing. So we read The Shape of History for class, and that is an example. There's another example with swans on page 941. So this PowerPoint presentation has been about prosody and form and a lot of the terms that we can use to discuss